Minä olen Josefina Tuomala ja toimin tänään lavajuontajana. Seuraavaksi täällä alkaa pienen näyttämön torstain viimeinen ohjelmanumero. Tuttuun tapaan kaikki ohjelmasisällöt live-striimataan ja suomenkielinen sisältö tulkataan englanniksi. Seuraavan ohjelman kieli tulee olemaan englanti, joten jatkan juonnoon loppuun englannin kielellä. Hi everyone. Welcome to Thursday's last program here at the Little Stage. All programs are live streamed and Finnish programs are simultaneously interpreted into English. The chat is open. If you want to participate in the discussion, there is a QR code on the screen that will take you straight to the chat. Next up, the panel titled A Common Economic Policy as a Guarantee of EU Security will take the floor here at the Little Stage. This panel is brought to you by the Bank of Finland's Monetary Policy and Research Department. Welcome everyone.
So, welcome to all of you to this actually second Bank of Finland event in this European Forum. It's great to be here back in Turku, very sunny and warm weather. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel on common economic policy as a EU security guarantee. Our motivation to organize this panel is to embark into discussion on common economic policy primarily, and what it can or should do to contribute to EU security. And my name is Juha Kilponen. I'm a head of Monetary Policy and Research Department at the Bank of Finland. And we have here three distinguished experts on European politics and policies. Juha Jokela, he's a program director from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Then we have Taneli Lahti, head of cabinet of Commissioner Urpilainen, and Niklas Poitiers, research fellow from Bruegel. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to join this panel. So I will say a few words to sort of set the scene for a lot of questions that we have prepared for you. I mean, at the first hand, it may sound a bit surprising topic for a central banker, but as you have certainly noticed, the word, say, geopolitics appears very often in many central bank governors' speeches, particularly in the euro area. And as we all know, the security situation in Europe has fundamentally been shaken by the Russia starting a war against Ukraine in February 2022. And it has without doubt shaped the geopolitical landscape and is now reflected very widely in economic developments, and also, of course, in economic policies. Russia weaponized its energy exports to the EU, and the resulting price hike in Europe particularly contributed to the recent weak growth across the EU. At the same time, we know that we are very dependent on China for many strategically important goods and raw materials. The US and China can be said to be in a trade war, and of course we have seen the US also introducing some tariffs on some European goods as well. So, I mean, in overall, we can say that the countries have become more inward-looking, as reflected in many protectionist trade policies, and importantly also on the renaissance of industrial policy, which have been already discussed here widely. Now, growth prospects for Europe are weak, even actually without these geopolitical events, due to demographics and slow productivity. It seems evident that European ability to innovate and scale innovations is lacking the United States, and now maybe also China. And if something we can see from the statistics that the productivity gap with US has lately grown even more striking than it was at the beginning of 2000. And we also know that the economic dependence on raw materials and markets outside Europe makes us vulnerable to these geopolitical events. And at the same time, the weak economic growth has contributed to increasing indebtedness, and tight public finances make it difficult to invest in security, climate, energy transition, and then eventually to find a ground for common economic policy in Europe. So we are in a quite challenging environment at the moment. So let me start digging a bit deeper on the trade policy first. So how do you see the EU's reaction in trade policy so far? I mean, EU has provisionally introduced tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, although these are in essence sort of traditional anti-dumping dumping measures. And more importantly, what should be the way forward? For instance, should Europe use similar measures than the US, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act? And at which level you think this kind of trade policy should be enacted, at the member state level or at the EU level? And maybe we start with Niklas, our guest from Bruegel.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think the last years in terms of trade policy have been transformative in some ways, and we've seen really a reframing of our trade policy and the way we think about our integration in the world. And if you look at macro statistics, you could think that nothing has changed. So trade had a blip during the COVID pandemic, and then basically recovered surprisingly quickly. And I think one thing that is also for me always important to say at this point is actually supply chain has been very resilient. If you consider the magnitude of the shocks that we experienced in recent years, actually the effect we had on our economy was in some ways from the trade side surprisingly small, or at least surprisingly short-lived. So it was just a couple of years until we kind of came out of the pandemic in terms of trade statistics. If we think about the gas crisis, also that is something that was a massive crisis for us, but at the same time something where I think we managed surprisingly well, much better than maybe many of us, I personally would have anticipated. But both of these, especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has really put into question our own view of the world and how Europe thinks about an integration in the world. And before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in many member states, and especially where I come from in Germany, there was a sentiment that an action like that would be economic suicide. It would be completely irrational because basically the gains you could get on economic terms would completely be outweighed by the cost of that. And I think in many ways this assessment was right. Russia has been isolated on the global stage, and it has been isolated in its economy and its growth prospects, which were not great to begin with because it has a very disadvantageous demographic, because basically it's a very resource-based economy in a world where the world wants, the advanced economies in particular, want to decarbonize. And these growth prospects have become even worse now that many of the brightest people have left Russia. A lot of young people had to go to war and so forth. However, what I think we didn't really account for was actually that someone like Putin has a completely different rationale about making decisions, and that he doesn't really care that much about the economic outcome, and he might not have the same kind of analytical framework that we use. And this had really changed also our perspective, and we think now about China. A war around Taiwan would be completely economic irrational. A major economic decoupling would be completely irrational. Yet we live in a world where maybe this kind of sense that everyone behaves rationally and in a game theory standard point, where how we would imagine it in our economic lectures, might not be the only thing that could happen. So I think here really the way we think about our relationships and the kind of rationales we subscribe to our trading partners has changed. And I think in this environment, we now have to think about the trade policy that we see. And these trade policies and also the industrial policy react in some way directly to what an economist we would describe as a terms of trade shock. So basically, terms of trade is the value of the export relative to the import. So if you have good terms of trade, you have to export less to buy the goods that you want to buy. If you have bad terms of trade, you have to export quite a lot. You have to sell a lot of your stuff to get the things you want. And what the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the energy crisis meant that suddenly a big chunk of our imports, which are energy goods, gas in particular, suddenly became much more expensive. So our inputs in the industry become more expensive, but our outputs didn't become more expensive. So it's additional terms of trade shock. And some way what we see now in the emphasis on manufacturing and industry is a reaction to that. We want to kind of cushion the shock, the effect this had on our manufacturing, through basically giving them money through subsidies or protecting them through industrial policies. But also, I think, and that is in the short run maybe rational. In the long run, it's maybe not a good growth strategy, which is often why economists like myself push back against it. But the other part of it is basically that in this environment where our own economy is under threat, and we really worry about our green transition, what it does to our manufacturing, we become much less willing to kind of put up with Chinese industrial policy. And what we see now with these Chinese EVs is really Europe. In some ways, as you're saying, it's a classical countervailing duty case, a classical anti-subsidy case. But in other ways, basically, there's a new theory how Europe treats Chinese industrial policy. If you read the case, the documents the Commission has put forward, you could apply the same logic to many different areas, to many different industries. The EU really says here that the entire Chinese economies and many different sectors, from the battery suppliers to the manufacturers of these cars, act on the global stage as a cartel, and they act as a cartel in order to suppress prices and export at beneficial rates. And if you argue that way, and they argue through using policy documents, using the Chinese constitution and thus far, if you argue this way, you could argue the same way in other sectors. So I think this is, the industry target here is important in its own right, but it also points towards maybe a new theory or how Europe might want to engage with a country like China in the future.
Thank you, Niklas. Taneli, do you want to...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think Niklas is perfectly right. I mean, there has been a change of trend, change of direction over the past few years in the way the EU conducts its trade policy, and it's been a reaction, of course, and a response to the way our main trading partners conduct their own trade policy, US, but also China. I think in every few years, the European Commission publishes a trade policy strategy. Usually, the title of that document suggests trade for all, openness of Europe, openness of this and that. Now the latest, and that was published maybe 3-4 years ago, and was titled Assertive Trade Policy. I remember, I was a bit worried about that, because that seems to suggest that we are turning inwards. We are turning, and assertive to me sounds that we are becoming defensive. Now, there may be reasons why we have to do so, but it is a new area, a new way of conducting policies that we are doing. It is a response to global developments, but it is not at all straightforward, because what I sometimes feel, and I'm working with Commissioner Urpilainen on international partnerships, which basically covers a very large part of the world, but not China and the US. And if we think about our policy actions, be it trade or otherwise, only in function of China or the US, we may forget about the rest of the world, and there may be impacts and effects on our other partners which we have not really thought of, or that we do not want to actually see. So we have to learn a new way of policy making, and which takes into account and also the more global impacts of our actions. Now, when it comes to the actual question, Juha, about the tariffs on Chinese cars, very controversial, very difficult. Similar or in the same direction as what the US has done in response to Chinese cars. We've seen a quick increase of imports to Europe of Chinese cars, very competitive prices, and of course, that puts the European car industry quite a lot at stress and pressure. So when we've done what we do, and we look carefully into the structure and the cost structure of the Chinese car industry, and we find that there are subsidies in there that then justify and legitimate the tariffs that we have now put in place, which are somewhere at around 20% up to 30%, depending on the producer. That will probably have as an impact, and that the prices of Chinese cars for consumers will increase, and the situation on the European car market will somewhat stabilize. But it can only be a temporary measure. It is not a permanent solution. And now I have to stress that I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Commission, but I've been starting to think that what we are actually seeing is that the Chinese government or the Chinese state, i.e. the Chinese taxpayer, is actually subsidizing the consumer prices of electric cars in Europe. Why should we be against that?
If you like Chinese cars, so it's...
But of course, we are against that because that puts the European car industry at huge pressure. But the consumer actually may benefit of these subsidies by a Chinese taxpayer. Now, The controversial thought that I cannot avoid is that should Europe still have a car industry in 50 years from now? Because a car industry makes a huge share of the European economy and the whole from research to supply chains to everything. The car industry is extremely important for the European economy as a whole. But evolution may suggest that perhaps somewhere down the road it doesn't make much sense to produce cars, at least in current scale in Europe anymore. At least if it then requires a very heavy subsidy from the European taxpayer or the European consumer to that industry. And we've seen in the 80s, we here in Europe, and we all wanted to produce TV sets. We thought that is absolutely crucial that we produce TV sets in Europe. Luckily, we don't do that anymore, and it is done more efficiently and cheaply somewhere else. Same with mobile phones. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we thought that we absolutely have to produce mobile phones in Europe. Now, not so much anymore. And it doesn't disappear completely, but the bulk of the production goes somewhere else, and that actually happens to the benefit of the European economy and the European consumer in the end. So here as well, short term, yes, these kind of actions are needed. Longer term, we have to think that we don't become dependent on these kind of measures.
Thank you. Very interesting. Of course, from that, it's about the competitiveness. If we find out over time that the car industry cannot be competitive, then obviously we shouldn't support it. But so far, I guess we still have some hope there. Juha, do you want to continue discussion on trade policy and how we have done so far, succeeded so far?
Maybe a little bit on one of the recent developments and coming from a foreign policy and security studies. So I think what has kind of changed, especially after Russia's brutal invasion, is that security considerations have come much more to the fore. This is, of course, reflected in the EU's economic security agenda, and I think the new Commission will take many of the elements from there. Of course, it's also connected to the COVID pandemic to some extent. In a way, the security of supply and the production chains and the value chains, all that was a big question. So that brings in maybe another layer, in a way, to the discussion that what should be or what needs to be produced in Europe or near Europe. And here I'm not thinking about the cars so much, but I'm thinking maybe more about the pharmaceutical products and of course all the digital world. So this is of course something where I think there is quite a lot of discussion now going on, and it's of course a difficult debate to have also with the trading partners, because often these restrictions related to the security considerations are seen as kind of a veiled protectionism, and I think this is something where there's quite a lot of effort now needed to explain the European perspective. Then the other element, what I was thinking was, I was going back to the times of Juncker Commission, and when the kind of the trade wars started because Donald Trump became the president and the Brexit took place. And I think the EU managed then quite well, not just respond to the changing environment, but to be also very proactive. So I think EU was using the space created by Donald Trump very effectively. And I think this was kind of it was reactive, but it was also very proactive. In a way, striking new trade deals and putting a new gear in trade negotiations and so forth, and we've seen some of the benefits of that currently. But now I've been thinking, and when we've been looking at the kind of also the so-called global South or the plural South, the kind of the voices and the rhetoric at least has to some extent also changed. And this kind of environment of strategic competition in the field of economy and trade is also something where the EU might not be able to exercise its kind of traditional tools and provide this kind of a third way between perhaps China and the US competition and so forth. Because also in the global south, and I think, Taneli, you know this very well, there is a lot of focus on that they want to keep the options open and they want to have sort of good bidding competitions and choose in a way from that environment. I think this puts EU in a little bit new situation in a way. It cannot expect that, the rest of the world would kind of see the value of EU trade deals, but maybe something new needs to be thought out, that how this realization of the benefits of those deals is articulated and also proven in practice. And this brings me to kind of my sort of a key point in a way, that I think EU has been quite good in responding to the changing world in the field of global economy. But then I'm more hesitant to say that the EU has been able to emerge as a proactive actor in that context in a way. One of the actors who shape actually the global economy. And I think this is of course something which I think we might have to just to learn with, or then we might have to think that what kind of tools, what kind of decision-making structures, what kind of ways to enforce EU unity is needed to become one of these sort of strategic poles of global economy, which can really provide credible sort of options to others to follow. So, because we all know that there is this demand that countries don't want to choose between US or China. They want to have more options to choose from, and of course EU could be one of the options.
Can I
Sure.
comment on that? Thanks, because I think this is a very important point, and it kind of puts our whole discussion, this discussion in the context. And we have, and Europe is still mostly seen as the good guy globally. Wherever you go in the world, and people actually appreciate the things that we have in Europe, and the values and sort of European aesthetics. I mean, things that we represent: freedoms, openness, democracy, lifestyle, all of that, and the lifestyle power thing, and that has been mentioned a few years ago by World Bank and others. It's real. People actually like Europe and the European way of life quite a bit. It doesn't mean that everybody wants to move to Europe immediately, but they want to have the same kinds of things. What we represent is pretty popular. Now, still 30, 40 years ago, we also represented about 40% of global GDP. We were a global power. At the moment, it's somewhere between 15 and 20%. 10 years down the road, it's closer to 10%. And we still will have influence because people appreciate the things that Europe represents. We will have economic clout as well, but it is much smaller than what it was and when we grew up. And the adjustment that we have to face and that we have to recognize is fast and much bigger than we may think. And Europe doesn't become redundant globally, but we certainly have to pull together in order to be relevant in the years to come.
Thanks a lot. Actually, that connects really well to one question from the audience in the chat. Somebody's asking, if the Chinese system is constantly producing overcapacity in different sectors, what is the next sector after EVs, the electric vehicles, where China wants to be the dominant player? What does it mean for Europe? Should we push back?
Solar panels was the first one, I think.
Yeah,
I think in solar panels actually they already are dominant. I think basically if you look at the what we hear from there are big policy meetings in China, and one significant one was the 2 sessions, which was, I think, in February, March, where they unveiled their new economic strategy. And they called this new productive forces. And the idea here really is that the Chinese economy, that according to this narrative is kind of based on mass manufacturing, wants to move from this model, which is very investment heavy, maybe building a lot on the real estate sector, to a model where basically advanced manufacturing will be the future of growth. So that's kind of the little bit the idea here. And that means really going up in the complexity of manufactured exports, and therefore also becoming much more closer to the things we might produce in Europe. So if you look at the export portfolio of a country like China, it is still, even though in some sectors, some advanced sectors, they're very successful, like EVs, like some electronics. If you look at what is classified as high-tech goods, it's actually not very diversified. If you look at Europe or the US, we export a huge amount of very, very different, very, very specialized products in pharmaceuticals and life science, in aerospace and all these kind of things, where China they're really successful in IT, in like ITC goods. So smartphones, laptops are all produced in China, and more of the components are produced in China. But if you look at something like aerospace, China's not really there. The airplanes are still kind of like, if they have this new airplane they want to build, the first commercial airplane they want to put into production, it's basically built primarily out of Western parts, imported parts or parts produced by, the engine comes from an American company and so forth, these kind of things. Mm-hmm. Similar to the Russian jet, the Sukhoi Superjet was also basically, I think 80% or even more Western parts. And the idea here really is to move up these value chains and move up this complexity. And the question is if they can execute that. And I think it's pretty much an open question. So I think it's very much consensus that the Chinese innovation system has become much more successful. At the same time, producing these things is not easy, and you need to build clusters. And if you look at our own industries, this has taken decades, and especially to go to the depth of high tech that we have, it has taken quite a long time. Mm-hmm. But also, if you look at how this industry operates in Europe and in the US, they build also around a lot of very sophisticated services. And I think this is where China will have struggle. On the one hand is that it's not really clear that this strategy will work out to replace the millions of jobs that will move out of traditional manufacturing, which was very labor-based, to this more advanced, more automized manufacturing. So it's not really clear that the jobs are there, but it's also not clear basically if the structure that they have really allow for this innovation to thrive in the amount that they would need to be successful in all these sectors. So the Chinese economy really, it's if you look at GDP per capita, it's still not close to even the poorest member states in the EU. And they have some part of the Chinese economy that is very rich. If you go to the coast, it is comparable to maybe European economy, but that's just a small part of the economy. And we might not think about France maybe as a superpower, but that would be able to do everything autonomously. Maybe French policymakers had that idea, and maybe some of them I think still do. But we would not take that seriously. In the same way, there's maybe a France-sized advanced manufacturing economy within China that can be very successful in certain sectors, but they will not be able to cover everything. And I think here, really managing these ambitions and managing to focus on certain things, that will be the challenge that they have.
Thanks a lot. We could spend all the time on talking about trade policy and this stuff, but let's change gears a little bit. So we were supposed to talk a bit more about common economic policy, and let me just take this discussion on discussing about the provision of public goods. So, within the EU, the provision of public goods has traditionally been at the responsibility of the member state. Mainly. There are exceptions such as the ETS, competition policy, ESM, COVID vaccination procurement, NGEU, and of course, common monetary policy. And now, in theory, in economic theory, the more centralized provision will be preferable if there is a strong spillover effects between the member states, fixed cost of production are high, and of course that the preference differences are small between the member states. And now the most classical example of public good is national defense. And indeed, this is the area that a lot of the EU joint effort is discussed, and also here in the Eurooppa-foorumi. And I would say, finally, so what are the possible ways of forward on this national defense and security union, as I've heard here, has been discussed a lot? Are there so meaningful efficiency gains to be reached by some more specific policy areas like joint procurement or infrastructure or something else in the in the defense industry? Or what do you think? How should we go with it? Thinking a bit more from the economic point of view. I don't know. You are an expert on this.
Not so much on the economy, but
but
the defense cooperation and defense markets industry is of course something which has been followed quite a long time. It's maybe good to remind ourselves that the developments, the recent developments which we now see, already started before the annexation of Crimea, 2013. I think European Council first addressed the need to establish and deepen defense markets and also industry, including the strong research component. But what has now changed is that the economic imperatives are still there, so the financial constraints of national budgets. But obviously the threat perceptions have changed, I would say, quite extensively. And of course, what the providing military assistance for Ukraine has demonstrated that there is not enough production lines and European defense industry to cater that need. And that brings in the question that whether Europe has an industry that could kind of, in a war situation, provide what the war economy needs. And I think this has changed in a way, and this is a new situation, and we see a lot of new development. Joint procurement might be a real game changer. And when you discuss in different capitals, in EU capitals, and it's not just what we often hear that it's the countries who have a border with Russia or particular history with Russia that are interested in this. It is quite widely shared. Of course, there are national threat perceptions, and they are still different, and the defense industry that the countries might want to see is something that has to accommodate several different kind of threat perceptions, and also in that way different kind of industries and weapon systems. But I think there is this kind of a new momentum at the moment. Then I think what becomes a sort of a crucial issue is the national interests, also national, one could say, economic interest in way of protecting own national defense industries. And of course, this is something where we have to wait and see whether the current trends actually lead to a sort of a new momentum that where these kind of barriers could be overcome. Then there is another very important context which shapes this, and that's of course the United States and the alliance. And we foreign policy scholars, we remember when this process started in 2013 and it went on. So we noted that there were no these speeches coming from Washington about the dangers of duplication, for instance, meaning that the EU is doing something similar than the NATO, and also that EU is building up capacity which could compete with the US defense industry. But when some of the recent developments, meaning the PESCO and the Defense Fund and so forth, were taken forward, suddenly these speeches reappeared. That was during the Donald Trump presidency, and it took us a little bit of surprise. And this has made me think that this is also one question that needs to be addressed when we have this transatlantic alliance. It's based on US security guarantees, but the other side of the coin is also that Europe buys a lot of US weapon systems, and this needs to be kind of negotiated in a way if the kind of the relationship is to remain the same. So I expect also that Washington is quite vigilant about the European aspirations. Of course, these might be alleviated with the fact that we all know that US needs to focus other regions and theaters than Europe. And then, of course, this gives Europe also the kind of potentially a joint agenda with the US to build up European defense industry and European capabilities and give US way to move other areas, meaning the Pacific and the Asia.
So maybe Taneli and Niklas, you have talked a lot about the defense industry, but obviously there are a lot of other potential areas. So what would you say, like, what would be the most sort of obvious or long-hanging fruits of public goods that could be produced more efficiently at the EU level?
European level,
at
yeah.
the national level?
And that really is a core question for European Union going forward. And I really like the way you put it, that the public goods that should be produced jointly or at that scale. Those where the fixed cost of production are highest and where there is a shared preference or least differences in the preferences between participating member states. But these preferences, they change over time. And they change as a function of developments around Europe or sometimes inside Europe. And we've seen here over the past 15 years already quite a bit of development in that regard. Financial stability could be argued to be a public good. And there was absolutely no willingness by member states to do anything about it jointly until a financial crisis hit us 15 years ago. And then thereafter we built the ESM and we built many structures, the banking union and so forth, which provide public goods for European citizens, which make perfect sense and bring savings to everybody, but that were impossible because of the differing preferences of member states before the crisis. We've seen similar developments with the COVID. Health was considered to be an absolutely national competence. Don't touch health, and this is ours, and not an EU competence, until COVID hit us. And then all of a sudden, it became a necessity to jointly develop and purchase and distribute vaccines. Energy. When the energy crisis hit us, then all of a sudden the impossible became possible. Again, same thing, and public good, to try to purchase.
The big shock.
Yes. And I think the next one will be defense. Again, because of an external shock that hits us. There, the savings that for European taxpayer and the potential savings for European taxpayer for joint purchase and so forth are obvious. And the savings are quite large and that can be achieved. But when it becomes possible, it will take a little bit of time. As Juha was saying, there's such inefficiencies in the current system, and Europe is producing 170 something different weapon systems. The US is producing 33, and still, and we don't seem to be competitive with the US offer. So, and there is much of rationalization and consolidation to be done there with gains for European citizens and taxpayers. Other similar areas of common public goods and where the gains of scale are clearest, I think research is a typical example of that. Research, innovation, development, and where you can doing things jointly and clearly achieve efficiency gains. Networks, physical networks, be it pipelines, cables, roads, whatever. And it's amazing to see how little willingness there is in member states to actually invest in cross-border infrastructure. Even when the money is there, they rather invest in their own domestic national infrastructure. The border crossing doesn't come from national decisions. It will have to come, and it will have to be European. We've seen it again with the Next Generation EU, and that the preferences are so clearly national. So I think, and these are examples of public goods that could be produced at European level with clear gains for European citizens individually and collectively. But when the political conditions are there, I don't know. And the economic and rational case is clearly there, but the political readiness is not yet. And that it requires some kind of an impulse, which then changes the national preferences so that they become conducive for doing things together.
Thanks, great. Niklas, do you want to add to this? I wanted to discuss a bit about the financing of public goods, but we can also continue a bit on this. And then if there's somebody in the audience I want to ask, willing to take questions. So far, nobody. Okay, Niklas.
Yeah, maybe I can try to segue into the financing question.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So I think one of the reasons we need Europe. So there's two reasons why we would want European funds for European public goods. The one is the efficiency of provision, or maybe there are even three. The one is the efficiency of provision. That, as you mentioned, for some goods there's just returns to scale. Maybe it makes more sense to provide them at this level because it's cheaper. The second one is basically that you might have unhealthy competition. And this is what we see in industrial policy. We have a very strict state aid regime in Europe, which I think is very good because it constrains what politicians can do and constrains also the likelihood of graft and all these kind of negative effects that certain types of industrial policy can have. And this is built on the premise that we don't want governments with subsidies to compete against each other, we want companies to compete against each other. But this means that basically now if we allow governments in the name of strategic autonomy provide funding for strategic projects, that suddenly we get into a world where companies can actually play out different governments against each other. And I think some of the subsidy amounts we see in cases like, for instance, the European Chips Act, where Germany is providing 10 billion euros to one single factory. Just to put it into perspective, that's more than the Berlin airport has cost, which was very controversial because it was so expensive. This was a public infrastructure project. Now if the public can use it, the chips factory, 10 billion euros transfer from the private to the public, or from the public to the private. Why is this number so high? I think you can only rationalize it because there was France, Germany, maybe Ireland, maybe the United States wanting this factory, and then basically the companies can go. And this is, of course, very inefficient. So there's also a case where we might want to have a European steering just to avoid this type of competition. And the third case is basically the financing. And I think here really it comes down to the fiscal rules. So because of what you mentioned about how problematic was the financing question in the past, we now have new fiscal rules, and the idea is that basically most of the European, or many of the European countries have actually to reduce their spending in order to meet these rules that we have set, because otherwise we think our macroeconomic governance doesn't work out if there's such an imbalance between the debt level between different countries. But at the same time, we have big new spending needs. The green transition, defense, and also other in industrial policy, the demographic transition, of course, pensions. We have all these kind of new funding needs that we have somehow to address. And if we restrict our national spending that we have, either we ignore these problems, which I don't think is an option, or we need to find other ways to fund. And I think this is where eventually we have to talk again about e-funding, because I think the fiscal rules itself, I mean, they will be difficult enough to enforce them in the first place, but basically to say, actually, let's increase it by 10% or whatever, I don't think that's politically viable. And here, there is, in many of these cases, there are returns to scale. There are effects. Like every country faces the same problems in the green transition. It's really about making it economically viable for consumers and for industry to invest into these things. Similarly in defense, as you were saying, basically we have all the same interests. So I think there are many areas where we actually can have a public goods logic that would justify actually spending EU money on this. And one area I want to highlight that I think is important here is actually also external financing. So external policy, not just trade policy, but also development policies and the like. If we look at a lot of these geopolitical tensions, where they play out in the economy, the one case we've seen now was gas, which is a macroeconomically big commodity that really showed up in our macro statistics. But a lot of it is also much smaller in what we call sometimes economic coercion. So now China has restricted exports to Europe of germanium and gallium, minerals you need to certain high-tech industries. And the question is, how do you respond to that and how do you mitigate that? And for many of these many different products that we import from a country like China that might hit us with these products, they will not be economically viable in Europe. And actually, it would be very expensive, very distortive, and probably impossible to try to reshore all of these production. So instead, we need them in the countries. And for many, especially these critical raw materials, the bottlenecks are not in the mining. The mining is relatively distributed, with a few exemptions, and often that will be cobalt in Congo, which is not China. So the monopoly that China has in cobalt, for instance, is just in the refining. And some of these steps we might be able to reshore, but some of them we might want to promote somewhere else. And really here, there's a strategic interest of us to do together development policy, and maybe not development in a traditional sense, but investment policies in third countries, in emerging markets, to diversify our supplies of these goods away from China in a way that I think that would basically make us more attractive as a partner to many of these countries, but also much more efficient to diversify imports than trying to reshore everything.
Yeah, so we have 2 minutes. But I still wanted to push a bit on the financing. So the NGEU, of course, it was launched during the pandemic, and one of the ideas there was, initially at least, was to finance green transition and finance digitalization and have some cross-border spillovers from that. But it seems that it hasn't worked that well from that perspective. So what are the lessons to learn from that way of financing the things? How could we do it better in Europe to make sure that this idea of the public good and cross-border spillovers can be achieved? How can we do this with the way we finance these goods?
I don't know. I think it's
a hard question.
It is a very hard question, and we struggle with it every time the Commission proposes a new financial framework for 7 years. And we try to put forward an emphasis on European public goods. Member states want to put an emphasis on transfers between member states. And for the financing side, and we usually put forward a proposal which put the emphasis on own resources, and the member states want to rather put the emphasis on payments and from their budgets, because it gives them more control. Next year, the new Commission will put forward another proposal for the next 7 years, and I can pretty much guess what we'll put forward and what will be the result after the negotiations. So very difficult. The weight of own resources in the financing of EU budget until late 90s was very high, and I think 2/3 even. And that was because that was the old world of trade policy, where tariffs were being collected by the Union, and the tariffs were the source of income for financing the EU budget. Now that is not the case anymore, which is why the share of own resources has diminished. I do not hope that tariffs will become again such an important part of financing, but something else will have to give in. Can I just one quick comment on a public good, and that is quite useful but not very well known: civil protection. There is a Union civil protection mechanism that not many people know about, but which basically is, as an example, that when there's a forest fire in one member state, then the other member states they send their planes to spread water on the fires. By doing so, not everybody needs to have 20 planes booked for the eventuality of a forest fire.
Good example.
Because you share, because you don't have forest fires everywhere at the same time, hopefully, or at least the likelihood is fairly low. So that is why it is this kind of mechanism saves everybody resources and funds, requires trust and confidence mutually, and a mechanism of doing things together. The EU functions with a very small budget, 1% of GDP, and this is what differs us from the rest of the global players. And we are a global power, a global player, alongside US and China with many indicators, except that we don't have common defense yet, and that we have a budget that is about 5% of the US federal budget or the Chinese budget. That puts the limit to how we can actually respond to global developments with any common economic policy. It doesn't make it impossible, but it just makes it very much more difficult.
Thanks a lot, Taneli. I'm afraid we are out of time here. Unless Juha, you want to use the last word.
Maybe the next generation EU, just very briefly, because I fully agree it has to be scrutinized, and that's very important. And I think many of us experts highlighted when it was launched, especially the RRF was launched, that this is really kind of now a situation where the member states and the European Union and Commission must show that this really works, because it will come back and haunt all the new funding proposals in the future. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that we can think about, for instance, the infamous Lisbon strategy from the year 2000, which kind of declare that the EU will be the leading knowledge-based and innovation-based economy in the world. And why it failed, there are of course many, many reasons for that. But one, what the experts are quite unanimous about, is that there was not funding and financial tools behind it enough. And when the Next Generation EU was launched, I was also thinking that now, when the EU launched the green transition, digital transition, at least there are now better financial tools to try to implement those big transition processes. So what I hope is also that when the Next Generation EU, I'm meaning also the union's budget, will be evaluated, so it will be looked into this broader picture in a way, how it has worked also in terms of putting the green transition, pushing forward and making it happen in a way. So I think it's a very important question for the future debates of the EU's finances, and especially in this country where there are still a lot of worries that the transfer union is something what is in the cards in every funding proposal what relates to the European Union.
Thanks a lot. I'm afraid we really have out of time now. So please join me to thank our panelists, Taneli, Juha, and Niklas, for excellent discussion.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you also joining us in this session. Thank you.
Thank you for taking part in today's Europe Forum. Hopefully you have enjoyed the diverse discussions of today. Tomorrow, the day starts here at Little State at 9 a.m. with the Eurooppa-foorumi Turussa Association's program, A Debate with Finnish MEPs. If you want to keep discussing Europe Forum on social media, don't forget to use the hashtags Eurooppa-foorumi, #Europe Forum, and #Turku. Thank you. See you tomorrow.